Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm going to walk you through the basics of how to analyse a survey. We've put this together for survey analysis beginners. If you've never gone through all the steps in analysing a survey on your own, then this webinar is just for you. As we go along, type any questions you've got into the GoToWebinar app, and I'll get to them at the end. We're going to do this by completing a case study of the iLock. I'll give you a chance to read the concept. I'm going to take you through 8 stages in analysing a survey. The first stage is to make sure you get the right type of data file. This is the big mistake that people make when they're very new to analysing surveys. They click on the export button in the data collection software, or maybe somebody says do an Excel file, and because it's familiar, they choose that option. But Excel files and the related CSV files weren't invented for survey analysis. Yes, you can use them, and I'll show you how in a second, but it takes double the time. You end up making mistakes sometimes as well. There are 3 great data file formats specifically designed for surveys. The most well-known was invented many years ago by a division of IBM called Spss. This file format is the industry standard and is used by just about all survey analysis software. The files are called Spss data files or .sav files. There are actually 2 even better formats, something called MDD or a Spss 2.1 file, but they're a bit harder to get and a bit exotic. Now, if you're using Displayr or Q, you can do even better than any of these file formats. And as long as you've collected your data in one of Decipher, SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, you can just suck that data straight in, and then you don't even have to worry about any aspect of file formats because all happens in the background for you. But let's say you've got one of these worse files like an Excel or a CSV file and you just can't get a better file. You can still do analysis, but you've got to spend some time tidying it up. You need to get the file so it looks something like this. The first row contains what are called the variable names that describe each of the different bits of data. You need to have a column which contains a unique ID, some number or reference number for each person that completed the survey. Each row should represent one and only one person. The data should be stored numerically where appropriate, and the exception to that is if you've got long lists of options that have no natural ordering like region or gender, or short things with no order like gender, you can store them as text. And if you've got questions that allowed people to choose multiple options, you want to store them like this as ones and zeros. So that's what it should look like. Now, I often see people struggle because they've got a file that looks like this. And they think it's good because it's got lots of relevant information. The problem is it's just the structure of it's not quite right. The info's there, but the structure isn't in a way a computer can understand. And the even worse type of data that a lot of people who are novices try and analyze is they've got data like this, and this is not actually a data file at all. These are actually showing outputs from somebody else's analysis. And as a general rule, there's not much you can do with this type of data. You need to go and try and get yourself a good file format, or if not, at least one of the Excel formats like I showed you just before. Now, I'm going to bring some data in, and I will bring in an spss.sav data file. And when I bring it in, I get a list of all of the sets of variables in the data shown down here on the left, and they broadly correspond to questions in the survey or other information stored in the database that was used to do the survey analysis. Now I need to move on to cleaning and tidying by variable set. What does that mean? Well, we go through and for each variable set, we create a summary table. Then we have a good look to see if it's actually dirty. Do we have dirty data? If we do, we need to clean it. And this is the detail of how to do it, but we're actually going to do it live. So I'm going to run a report, and this report will contain summary tables. Let's expand that group out. In a survey, as I mentioned before, each person should have a unique code, and that's what's shown here. It's not very interesting. It's good that we've got it though. This data is showing how long the questionnaire took for people to complete. It's a bit hard to read because it's in seconds. So what do we need to do? We need to create a new variable. So I'm going to click on this one here. And there's a whole lot of different ways of doing the analysis when we want to create variables, but the standard things that people want to choose from are shown in this list of ready-made variables. I'm going to choose divide, and I'm going to divide it by 60, turn into minutes. I'll rename it minutes. Just wait for it to quickly update. Right, now I'll drag that data across. And so we can see in minutes, the average time is around about 10 minutes. Now, usually what we're more interested in the average is actually the minimum. Because if people did the questionnaire in an implausibly short amount of time, we know they've given us garbage data and we'd need to delete it. In this case here, the fastest person took about 4 minutes. And for this questionnaire, it's a pretty short one. I can live with that. The database contains information about the user's language. Now, in this case, the database has been set up incorrectly. It's been set up so that it's storing this data as text data when really it contains categories. And so I just need to choose that data and just change that setup, making it structure nominal, which is the fancy jargon for categories. And now Displayr automatically shows me that I've got 100% of people within next to them, which means English. Note that on this table of gender information, we've got percentages and counts and the sample size. Now, this is another mistake that beginners often get pretty confused by. Beginners often want to report the counts, so it's quite common you'll see them go, in our survey, we had 166 females. This is never interesting, or virtually never interesting. It's always the percentages that are relevant because they're conclusions about the world at large. This survey is telling us that if the survey is representative, 55% of this market are female. That's interesting. That we had 166, not interesting. You can see here that a little significance testing, which I'll return to later, is emphasizing to us that this less than 18 group seems very, very small. And that's because most surveys aren't asked of people aged under 18. So I'm going to just remove that category so it doesn't distract us. With geographic data like this, I've got all the different states in America. The table's a bit too hard on my head to read. I'm going to instead visualize it when I'm cleaning this, and I'll create a geographic map, which I will hook up to that table of data on states. And if you've got a good understanding of the American geographic distribution of population by state, you'll see that this is basically kind of right. Got California's got a lot of people, as does Texas, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. So in terms of geography, this survey is looking all right, so that's good. Now, looking at this population density, now we get to a very important bit of tidying data, which is sometimes you'll have categories that are just too small. So we've only got 9 people in this group of an isolated location. Now, when we've got demographic data like this, we're usually wanting to compare. So how do people in one category compare to the other? And if we've only got 9 people, there's not much we can do. So we're going to merge it to the most adjacent category. With the education, we've also got another category, never attended school. It's very small. I could remove that or I could combine it. I'm going to combine them together. It's a bit arbitrary, which you do here. Now, with this race data, there's a few things to note here. First is a slightly technical point, but with data like this, sorry, struggling to use my mouse and talk at the same time. Can't chew gum either. All right. With data like this, it's actually stored in the underlying data as multiple different variables because people are allowed to choose multiple races because people may choose to decide that they're both Hispanic and Black or forever. So in the data file, this is actually stored as multiple variables. And they're grouped together into a single variable set called race. Displayr and other product Q have done that entirely automatically. Now, to tidy this up, we've got to do a few things. You'll see we've got some very small groups here. So we're going to do what we did before, and we're going to merge them together. And the standard technical term, whenever we group anything in market research, is we just write other, term of art. The other problem with this data here, which is making it messy, is these labels are too long. They're long so that we can easily capture the data so they're not ambiguous to people. People know what we're wanting to, category they want to choose, but at reporting time, such a lack of brevity makes it really painful. So we want to simplify a lot. Okay, so that's now clean and tidy. This next bit of data is showing income. Now, the actual label we've got here is a very verbose one, so we're going to tidy it up and just change it to income. Now, there are lots and lots of categories here, and that kind of does my head in. There's too many categories for me to easily read, and I'm much more interested in viewing an average. How do I do that? Well, I can click on the table, and I can put an average below it. It's one way I can do it. And when I do that, I get a very weird number, 17.7. What does an average income of 17.7 mean? To understand that, we need to look into the data and see how the data is set up in terms of the values that are associated with different labels. And we can see here that if they chose under 1,000, this has been stored in the database as a 1, 1,000 to 3,000 stored as 2, and this is very common that you find data like this. Now, the fix is you put in midpoints, and that will allow us to compute a sensible average, but there's a lot of categories, so that's a bit boring. So we're going to automate the process, and we're just going to, again, select the variable, go into these ready-made new variables, and we've got this lovely option of numeric variables from code category midpoints, which is going to do exactly what we want. And then we'll drag it on and replace the current income table. And now it's showing me the average income is 63,000. And what it's done in the background is that midpoint recoding that I started doing before. Now we get to a much more interesting one. Here we have data from a question where we asked people what they liked about the product. Again, it's a bit verbose, so I'm just going to relabel it. And I'll also relabel the page, which is taken on the name of the variable. Now, we've got 300 respondents in this survey. We could read through it all, but then we're not doing our job of summarizing information. Now, there's a standard way that market researchers deal with this type of data, and it's to do what they call coding, but it's probably better described as categorization for the rest of us. And the way it works is we select the data, we go down here, we go into text categorization, and I've got a separate webinar where I explain what all these options mean. Here, I'm just going to focus giving you the basic idea. Right, so the first person in the survey has answered that they like it because 222. Now, I think I'm going to create a new category, this called poor quality data. And I'll categorize that respondent into that group. Now I've got 109 people that have said nothing. So I'll move all those 109 people into the nothing category. Now, the process for categorizing this kind of data is really you read through it, you create new categories, and then you manually move that data across into those categories. And as I said, I'll show that in another webinar, and we've got a webinar on our website if you want to look at it, but it's a boring process, so I'm not going to bore you with it now. I did it before the webinar started, and I'll import that now. And so here it is all categorized. So I click Save Categories. And now that I've done that, a new set of variables appears here, and I can drag it onto my screen, and I just get a table as if I'd asked this as a question, and I'll give you a moment to quickly read these options. If you look at the third row from the bottom, we can see we do have a bit of a problem. We ended up with 5% of people who have given us these poor quality responses. Now, I'm going to look at these guys in the data editor now, which is just going to show me all of the responses. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new filter. I'm actually going to filter this for all of the people who said poor quality responses. So I click that categorization I just created. I'll choose poor quality data, create the filter. I'm just going to apply that filter. And so it's going to highlight in green any of these poor quality responses. And as you can see, they're just garbage. Now, the challenge we have is that 5% of the people for this question have told us junk, and all the other questions people were choosing from a list, so we couldn't very easily see if it was junk. And so the odds are that all of their data is junk. And so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to delete them from my data set. Now, to do this, I've got a little housekeeping step. I've got to tell it which variable is my unique ID. When I go here, and now notice that I've got 16 rows that are containing the data of likes where it's garbage data. And you can see here I've got a total of 300 rows in my data set entirely. So I'm just going to right click on one of these green ones, delete rows matching filter. And now it's showing me that my data set's changed to show 284 rows. And if I click back on this table here, you can see poor quality data has gone down to 0%. So I've successfully cleaned out these respondents from the survey. My next bit of data is similar to the one before, but it's dislikes. And so I'm going to go through exactly that same workflow. I'm going to tidy up the data, just have a better label. I click on it, I go and I'm going to categorize it. And rather than do it manually, again, I did this before I started the webinar. And so here's our table as if we had given people these options. Now it says 0% poor quality data, and there's another little bit of a trick here for beginners. It's very easy to go, 0%, I don't have any, but our sample size is 284. And so what we should do is we should really put some counts onto the table. And we do have one of them. So we need to go through the same workflow that we went through before. I'm going to view in the data editor this variable. I'm going to create another new filter where I choose now the dislikes, choose the poor quality data, create that filter, and just apply that filter. Let's just scroll down and check it's all right. We're just looking for a green row with some garbage data in it. All right, and here we go. And I think that might be Spanish, but remember, everybody's meant to be English speaking. We saw that before, so goodbye. I'm going to delete this person as well. All right, now we get to the more interesting bits of data here. This question asked people how likely they would be to buy the product. Now, the standard term for that is purchase intent. Now, you'll remember we showed the concept at the beginning, and I'll just remind you of what it looked like. So we've asked people how likely they would be to buy this particular product, and that's what this purchase intent is showing us. And I've said priced, but I should say unpriced. Now I'm also going to change the description of the data. And this kind of housekeeping, it saves a heap of time. Just means that all your reporting is tidy, means it's easy to find things. All right, now this data is basically clean other than its label. The next bit of data we have is asking the question, compared with similar products, how likely are you to, let's wait for it to load up. It's a terrible time when you get a little internet going slow warnings appearing on the screen, which allows me to see also that it says I'm called Matilda Sarah in the system, but my name's Tim Bock. Anyway, so here's the data that's loaded up. Now this question here, as I say, you can see how different you think this is. And this is a measure of uniqueness, is what we generally refer to this as. The idea is that you want your new products to be relatively unique. You can see here that most people have said it's relatively unique, which is good. And this next bit of data is how well it fits with the brand, and we'd often call this brand fit. Now, there are lots of small categories, so just as before, there's a real utility in combining them together. And we can see here that very few people have really said it doesn't fit at all with the Apple brand, so our brand fit data is all right. And this last bit of data we've got is we've asked the question again, how likely they would be to buy the product, but we gave them a price, so it's price purchase intent. So I'll just update the description of the label. And our very final bit of data table here is showing us browser meta info, which is information that's been passively recorded about what type of browser the people completed the survey on. Again, it's incorrectly stored as text data, so I just changed that as we did earlier. Okay, so good news is you've now seen how we clean and tidy data. As I said, here's all the steps. The next step in analyzing survey is to weight if you need to do any weighting. And the basic process for doing this is you find key data that you can compare to population data. And we looked at the geographic data before. Let's have a look at gender and age, which are the other two bits of data that people tend to look at. Now, before doing this webinar, I looked up the data on the US Bureau of Census, their projections, and we should have about 51% females. So we've got a few too many females, but it's very marginal. Similarly, with the age data, we don't have quite enough people in this 55 to 64 category, and we've got too many in the 18 to 24 category, but it's marginal. So we could weight the data, but you should only weight if you really need to weight. And so I'm going to ask you to weight, because next week I'll have a more detailed webinar looking at weighting, and I'll find better examples where it should be applied. In this case here, I'm just going to put the conclusion: no need to weight the data. It's relatively close to the US population. Cool. Now, the next bit of the analysis change to filter specific analyses and results. Now, we have already done a little bit of filtering when we were deleting cases, and we're going to return and do a little bit more filtering shortly. But this next topic is the thing that really separates out expert researchers from the rest. Well, before you look at your data, you need to very carefully think through the key results you want to find, key things you want to look. Now, the novices instead open the data up and try and find interesting things, and that just doesn't work. Unless you take the time to write down what's interesting before you look at your data, you almost always get lost. So what does an analysis plan look like? This is a fairly simple analysis plan. Now, it's got discussions on the data checking, preparation, data cleaning and weighting, which are all things that we're not going to go through now because we've just been through it where it was applicable. There's a couple of advanced analyses here, which I'm not going to cover in this webinar, but I'll do them in other webinars. There's a great one already, which does all this advanced analysis on finding the data story. But the key ones to draw your attention to are these planned tables and visualizations. And so And I'll give you a chance to just read this bottom right-hand section. Okay, so these are the things we need to do. So you'll remember before, and let's create a new page to do this. We're gonna look at our purchase intent data. So the first thing we need to do is to look at the priced purchase intent and compare it to a cutoff of 25%. I've dragged the wrong data across. Let's try this one. Oop, I relabeled the wrong data. That was my problem. All right, so we've scored 11% saying they would definitely buy it. To analyze that kind of data, you never believe it when people say they're going to buy something. You always want to compare it to a benchmark. And the benchmark that we've used in this study, it's a fairly common one, is 25% need to buy it before we're going to believe anyone's really going to buy it. So let's put a little comment on. A lot of people like to be very dry and conservative in their language. I don't. Data analysis can be boring, and data presentations can be boring, so I'm always looking for a way to break through that boredom a little bit. Now, in our analysis plan, what else do we have to do? It said we want to compare, going down here, we want to investigate ways of improving the concept. So first we look at pricing, compare the priced versus the unpriced concept. Let's go and do that. Now, the unpriced score is the first thing we looked at. And you can see something quite interesting here. With no price, still only 11% said they'd definitely buy it. And what you'd expect to see is that this number should be a lot higher than this number if price was important. But it's telling us that actually price isn't the thing. So let's add that conclusion. All right, now the next thing that the analysis plan wanted us to do was it wanted us to look at the data for uniqueness and brand fit. And I'm just going to drag this to the top of the report, building a report. Oops. And so you can see here the brand fit, as we talked about before, there's not that many people said it doesn't fit. There's not that many people said it's not at all different. And so this kind of adds to our slightly depressing message we're getting here. Now, there's some other data that the analysis plan also referred to. It wanted us to look at the dislikes, so let's drag them up here. Now, the key, and we'll get rid of the raw data, that's not that interesting. Now, what it wanted us to do is it wanted us to focus on people who are ambivalent towards the concept, because when you've got a small purchase intent, you need to look at the people who weren't saying they definitely buy, but who might buy and see what they dislike. And whatever that is something that you can probably improve upon. So we're going to filter now this particular table. And again, we're filtering on the reasons for, in this case here, the priced purchase intent. And so we're going to look at the people who said they'd probably buy, not sure, or probably not. So these are all fence sitters. And we can see here there's no common theme. The main dislike was nothing. So they're just ambivalent, right? So we're getting a, just not that appealing. So we've now done all of the planned analyses, but it's usually a good idea to do additional exploratory analyses. And in the purchase, in our analysis plan, it had this idea that what we were going to do is run a report. which is called crosstabs, and we want to look at our purchase intent priced. We're going to crosstab it by, let's look at all of the demographics. Right, so now I've got these extra tables showing crosstabs. A few things to note about this. Well, firstly, I'll explain what they are. Crosstab is basically data where I've filtered it. So in this case, the first column is showing purchase intent amongst males, so filtered by males. Second column, purchase intent amongst females. Third column, everybody, the net or grouping of males and females. Now, 10% versus 13%. So the concept had a slightly higher score amongst females, but with any survey, we've only got 283 people in our study now. Random flukes mean we're going to get differences like this. And so we shouldn't pay too much attention to it. Now, if the difference is likely to not be a fluke, we're going to have these little arrows, which are called significance testing symbols, appearing on it. And we've got a difference between being ambivalent, but who cares? The key thing is this number, no arrows here, so not much is going on by gender. If we look at the data by age, however, we are seeing a very clear pattern here. The younger I am, the higher my purchase intent, and it declines over time. So that's an interesting result. I'm going to move it up here to the top. I want to keep that for later. If I look at my state data, I do have Alabama, which has got a much higher purchase intent, but if I look at the data, I'm going to see that there's not that many Alabamans in my sample. There's only 5 of them, so I'm not going to build a story based on that. No, nothing going on with state. Population density, no colors, I'll move on. Education, I've got some significant results, but they don't relate to my key metric of it I would definitely buy, so I'm going to ignore them. Race, well, we do have something interesting here. The appeal is much higher in the Black community and it's much lower in the white community. The Asian community has actually got a score very similar to the Black community. It's presumably the sample size is too small. Let's have a look at that to work anything out, because the smaller your sample size, the harder it is to draw any conclusion. That's why there's no arrow attached here. If you want to compare the groups, we can of course do that. There's other kinds of more complicated statistical tests designed for that, which I'll just flag to show you here, but we've got another webinar on that topic as well. I'm going to turn them off. All right, so the race information is interesting. And lastly, if we look at the income, the average income is not significantly different for any of these categories, so nothing is going on there. All right, so we're almost done now. Let's go and look where we are in our analysis process, in our reporting process. We did our crosstabs, we've done stat testing to work out what's significant. Now we need to find the story in the data. And this is actually simple, according to Michelangelo, and asked the question by the Pope of the day. He said, the way I did David was I just removed everything that's not David. And our David here is interesting. We just want to remove everything that's not interesting. And so what's not interesting? Well, I'm going to get rid of all of those slides I created before in my actual presentation, except for this one. Oops. So you'll remember as I was working, I was moving all of my interesting results to the top to save a bit of time. So now I've greatly reduced my presentation, which is great. What have I got to do next? Select this guy. The optimal way to organize information is to create a hierarchy, to make it really obvious what is important. Now, the key thing for us in this data is really simple, which is just not that many people were that interested. And the way I'm going to communicate that is I'm just going to create one slide, which I'm going to try and maximize the impact. Don't want anyone to miss your conclusion, I always think. I'm going to put a red box over this just to really indicate what I mean by making it really obvious. I've got a special red that I'm going to use for this, and I'm going to make it semi-transparent. Now I'm going to turn this into a kind of little fake column or stacked column chart. I'm going to create another box, just copying the first one. I'm going to make this other box around about 11% of the height. I could get very meticulous and draw it in, but I'm a bit lazy for that. And I'll put a little text box on top now. So it's very hard to miss what we're saying here. Now, if my audience wants to get more information, we've got this other information here that we started looking at before. I'll call this diagnostics. And all of this other information are kind of sub bits of information. So I'm going to create a little pyramid structure. I'm going to drag them underneath here if the user wants to look at them. Got this very uninteresting stuff about no need to weight the data, which I'll move to the end as an appendix. Got this slide on age. I think that's interesting, but I definitely want to look at that. I think as a chart will be a much better way of showing it. All right, I think that does a reasonable job of showing it. I could play around and pretty it a bit more, but I won't at this stage. All right, so we've got our pyramid structure. We've added a little bit of gloss with the color and stuff at the front. I was doing it quickly, but you get the idea. This is the process we've gone through. Later this week, we'll email you a recording of this webinar. What questions do you have? Please type them into the questions field and go to webinar, and I'll answer them right now. But before I do, a quick advertisement. If you're not a Displayr user, go to our website, www.displayr.com, and sign up for a free trial, and we'll show you how to use it. Or sign up for a demo, we'll give you a demo on how to use it. Everything I've shown you, I've presented in Displayr. So Natalie has said, with the age variable, how do you calculate an average age? Now, Natalie wrote this question before I'd done the average income, so hopefully she's seen it. But let's go, and I'll quickly do that process now. I'm going to create a new page, and I'm going to, just like I did before, I'm going to create a new variable, ready-made new variables, and I'm going to convert it now to have the midpoints like we did before. And it's giving me a warning here. It's a bit nervous that it couldn't guess some of the labels. So let's have a little look and see how it did. Drag it onto the page. So it's showing me an average age of 44, but we'll click just to check that it did a good job guessing the labels. Yeah, and so 65 years or older, it wasn't quite sure. It's gone with 65. I always like to do 72, but generally has very little effect on any of the results. Peter says, what was purchase intent by current iPhone user? Let's have a look at that. It's a good way. Now, we don't have iPhone user, but we've got that data at the end looking at what type of browser they had. So it's a nice idea. Good analysis skills here, Peter. We'll drag across the purchase intent price. And then we'll create a cross tab by dragging across that browser information. And we are seeing that amongst the Safari iPhone users, we do have a higher purchase intent. So that's a good finding. Nice one, Peter. Stephen asks, is there a limit to how many variables you can put or categories you can have in the top of a cross tab? No, there's not really, but it gets hard to read pretty quickly if you've got too many. So at the moment, I've got, you can see here, these categories here. I'm going to drag across another set of categories. I'll drag across all the income categories, and I hover over banner and I'll splice them to the right of the browser information. And so now we're getting a pretty big table, which is a bit painful. So the limit is really just how your brain works. I tend to not like to put multiple things across the top of a table because my brain's not good enough to deal with it. But if you want to, you can keep building them. You can change the page width, of course, to make it bigger as well if you wish to. Bob asks, what do I do if I've got a revised data file? Do I have to manually do all of the cleaning again? No, you don't, Bob. The Displayr is great for that kind of problem, as is our other product queue. You would just click on the data file, click update, swap the data file, and we'll do almost all of the cleaning. So we'd get all the changing the values, the recoding, all the new variables we've created, all of that would update. The only thing that wouldn't change is we wouldn't automatically delete cases from the new file, because our experience is that's a bit mysterious and people get a bit lost when that happens automatically. And another question, can I talk more about the weighting soon? Yes, I've got a webinar on the weighting next week. I'm not going to jump into it right now, other than to say it's designed to deal with situations where you have too few people that you need to have in your study of a particular type, thus causing the study to not be representative. Anyway, thank you all for joining this webinar. To all of our customers out there, thank you so much for being our customers, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye now.